I don't need to introduce the next speaker, Anna Kavanagh and Tusla, the Fight for Justice. Put your hands together, please. Thank you.
Hello. I think they have a mic on me. I'll just test the mic on me. So, can everybody hear me? I have a special... It's not very clear. No. Okay. I think... No. I don't need a chair. Whoever... No, the sound will be adjusted by our sound engineer. Is that any better? Yeah. I have a special request to the people at the back, if you wouldn't mind moving closer towards the front. Please. You can hear me. They're like the fellas at the back of the chapel, aren't they? You know, on a Sunday morning. Yeah, the unbelievables, yeah. And that's what, so all the Holy Marys and Joes are at the front. My name is Anna Kavanagh, and I just want to thank you for coming in this afternoon to hear what I have to say. Some of you may be familiar with some of the work that I'm doing, so maybe if you just put up your hands if you're familiar with the work that I'm doing. Right, okay, there are a fair few of you, and some of you are not. So for the people who are not familiar with me, as I said, my name is Anna Kavanagh. I'm a retired teacher, I'm a widow, and I'm a mother to 3 grown-up children. And I retired from teaching last year, and my intention was to take up nice pursuits like knitting and meeting up with friends for coffee. But it hasn't actually quite worked out that way, because last December, I think it was, I was called down to the scene of the eviction in Strokestown, where the McGann family had been evicted from their home, and I was contacted, and I reported live from the scene of the eviction over 10 days, and I became quite well known on Facebook. And the other thing that I started doing was volunteering with Athlone Community Radio. And people began contacting me on Facebook. And in particular, one woman, I think she was probably the first. She was a Polish lady living in the south of Ireland. And her English was quite broken. And through her messages, she was trying to convey to me that she had lost her child through the Irish courts. And I wasn't really paying her much heed until she sent me a link to a documentary that was done in Poland, and it would be the equivalent of prime time here in Ireland. It was, you know, we all have prime time investigates. We're familiar with prime time investigates here on RTE. Well, this programme was done by the equivalent in Poland, and it aired on primetime television on Poland. And it documented this Polish lady's experience here in Ireland. And it was subtitled in English. And what actually happened was that she got involved in a relationship with an Irish man. Her child, they had a boy, a son. It came to her attention that he was being sexually abused. She took him to Professor Michael Fitzgerald, who is probably the most eminent psychiatrist in the country dealing with children. And he examined the child and wrote up a report, and the sexual abuse on this child was at the high end of the scale. Now, bear in mind, when this investigation was carried out by Professor Fitzgerald on the child, his wife, Frances, was actually the Minister for Justice here in Ireland at that time. To cut a very long story short, the case ended up in the family law courts, and custody of the child, 100%, was given to the father. And yes, and her access to the child was cut off entirely, and she hadn't seen her child for a couple of years. And Kathy Sinnott spoke here on Friday, and Kathy Sinnott actually was one of the people who contributed to that Polish documentary. Now, I hadn't fully understood what the mother was telling me until I saw that documentary. And I watched it in bed one night, and I was so disturbed by what I saw. I came down to the kitchen in my pyjamas, and I went on Facebook Live. And I told the story of what I was after seeing. And the video went viral. I think, now I'm not too sure on this, I could stand corrected on it, but I think that video has been viewed almost 500,000 times at this stage. And what actually happened was that it opened up a Pandora box, and mothers began contacting me through Facebook Messenger, and I gave them my phone number, and they started phoning me. And the stories, one story after another, was more horrific. And I wasn't, and I'm still not, equipped or trained to listen to these stories. And I listened. Sometimes the calls lasted for hours on end. And there were many nights that I didn't sleep after what I was after hearing. And they all involved Tusla. And up until that stage, I had never heard of Tusla. And then I began to investigate, what is Tusla? Who is Tusla? And I'm just going to give you a little history now of Tusla. Back in many decades ago, there was no single state entity dealing with child welfare in this country. First of all, it was dealt with the old health boards, and they employed social workers. And then the health boards were amalgamated into the HSE. And there were a number of horrific cases where children actually died in state care. And it was all brushed under the carpet. Fianna Fáil were in power at the time, and Fine Gael were in opposition. And Alan Shatter was the spokesperson for children. And he brought together a number of concerned people, including a social worker who was working on the front line in the out-of-hours service in Dublin. Her name was Maura Butterley. And they formed a committee, and they drafted a report with a number of recommendations. And one of them was that a special ministerial position be given to children, because up until that there was no such thing as a Minister for Children. And that responsibility for children be taken away from the HSE and that a new entity be set up. In 2012, Fine Gael came to power. Fianna Fáil lost the elections, and Frances Fitzgerald was appointed the First Minister for Children. And in 2014, she drafted the legislation that brought Tusla into being. Tusla was born, a new state body with responsibility for child protection and child welfare. And the first head of Tusla was a man called Fred McBride. Now, who was Fred McBride, and where did Fred McBride come from? Well, Fred McBride was the Director of Childcare and Child Welfare Services in Dundee in Scotland back in 2009. And the grandparents, the grandmother of a little boy called Brandon Muir, went to social services a number of times, and she told them that her grandchild was at risk of actually being murdered. And she was ignored. And the child was, in fact, horrifically murdered. Brandon Muir is the name of the child. You can Google all of this, it's out there. Brandon was murdered, and of course, the investigation was set up. When the report was finally published, Fred McBride had moved on from Dundee, and he ended up here in Ireland, began work in 2013 for the HSE, and then he became the CEO for Tusla. So that is how Tusla came into being. Tusla was set up in a way by Francis Fitzgerald that it can never be prosecuted. Nobody in Tusla can ever be prosecuted. Now, I am giving my opinion here. Let me preface what I'm saying by saying I am not an expert on anything. And that is why I'm sitting here at the edge of the stage, because I am not qualified to stand on a stage and talk down to you, because I'm not an expert on anything. I'm just here to give my opinion. I'm here to give my experience of Tusla in the last year. And nobody is infallible. And what I have to say may well be contradicted. And I would be very happy for people to come up and contradict me and say to me, Anna, you are totally wrong. Because what will actually happen is a debate. It'll get a discussion going. So for the moment, I stand uncontradicted. I'm not saying that I'm right. Right? I'm not saying that I'm right. But I am perfectly open to be contradicted. And if somebody presents the facts to me and says to me, Anna, you are wrong, I'll say, I'm 100% wrong, and I have no difficulty in making a public statement declaring that I'm wrong. I never have a difficulty with that. So, Tusla was set up in a way that it can't be prosecuted. It is self-policing. HICWA come in and they carry out investigations on Tusla's activities. They write up reports, and in fact, they have written up report after report after report after report slating Tusla. But it goes nowhere, because Tusla is self-policing. Tusla itself polices itself. Tusla itself, within its organisation, is supposed to sanction the people that are guilty of misconduct. And we have two clues as to how Tusla self-polices. The first one occurred here in the southeast, the horrific Grace case, where Grace, a child with special needs, was left for 20 years in a foster home, where it was known to the social workers that she was being horrifically sexually abused. And not alone that, social workers here in the southeast actually allowed 46 other children to pass through that home. When all of this came to light, what happened to the social workers that were involved? It's on the public record that they were actually promoted within Tusla. The Chief of Operations of Tusla today is a man called Jim Gibson, and he actually was area manager here in Waterford. When he was questioned, and it's recorded in the Irish Examiner, everything that I'm saying is in the public domain. When he was questioned about this, he said that he had taken legal advice and he wouldn't be commenting on the fact that the people within Tusla who were responsible for leaving Grace in that foster home, he wouldn't be commenting on the fact that they were promoted. The second clue we have about Tusla occurred in the Charlton Tribunal. We all know what happened to Maurice McCabe, that when he began to whistleblow about Garda corruption, a file was opened up on him by officials within Tusla, files that he was sexually abusing his children. And I suppose the question that the Charlton Tribunal had to investigate was was there collusion between the Gardaí and Tusla? Now, our friend Jim Gibson was the person who represented Tusla at the Charlton Tribunal, and he said that it was a copy and paste error. Accidentally, they copied allegations of child sex abuse into documents bearing Maurice McCabe's name. It was all a mistake, right? So that is how Tusla self-polices itself. Getting back to my own experience, as I was taking the phone calls, I began to notice a pattern, a very distinct pattern. And I don't mean this in a disrespectful way. We all have accents. And you know when somebody is speaking to you, and I'm a teacher, so I'm sensitive to it. You know when somebody is speaking to you, largely the level of their education, by how, by their vocabulary and how they speak and so on. And I began to notice a distinct pattern. A minute on the phone to a mother, if her accent was working class, I knew she was going to tell me a story, that she was the victim of horrific domestic violence. She had been beaten to a pulp by her husband. She had ended up being investigated by Tusla, that her children were taken from her and they were either put into foster care or custody was given to the abusing father. And that is hard to believe. A number of mothers were actually women who grew up in foster care themselves. And they never could get away from the clutches of the social workers. And when they became pregnant, the social workers got involved with them. And in a number of cases, the same social workers that they had as children growing up in foster care were now the social workers taking their children from them and putting them into foster care. There is no research being done in Ireland on the profiles of mothers whose children are being taken. There's no research being done in Ireland on the outcomes for children that grow up in foster care. But the research that's done in the United Kingdom and the research that's done in America is some clue to what is happening here in Ireland. And I'll speak about research that I did myself in a few minutes. But in the United Kingdom now, domestic violence has overtaken drug abuse and alcoholism and mental health issues as the #1 reason for the removal of children from their mothers. That's fact. That's what the research is showing in the UK. And I did a survey of 25 mothers. 16 of them had their children removed by Tusla. 11 of them were victims of domestic violence, and 10 of them had a barring order in place when the children were removed. And you'd say to yourself, how can this happen? But it does happen. So I'm just going to share with you a few of the stories of how Tusla deal with the victims of domestic violence. One mother was hospitalised after a beating that she got at the hands of her partner. She had 2 children. She got a barring order against him. Tusla stepped in and they put a supervision order on her. They told her she could not leave the county in which they were residing, because if she did, they would take the children from her. And they told her that she could not take the children out of the county that they were residing in. If she did, they would take the children from her. And her father was dying of cancer in a different county. And she couldn't visit her father. And she couldn't bring the children to visit their dying grandfather. That is fact. She asked me to go to a case conference with her. And I turned up at the case conference and accompanied her into the case conference with 3 social workers. They always seemed to come in packs of 3. And she was made to sit across the table from the man that had hospitalised her. And she was made to discuss with him a plan. They're big into co-parenting, right? And the co-parenting plan drawn up by Tusla was that he is to go to the house 4 times a week for 2 hours to be with his children. And if she feels uncomfortable with his presence in the house, she's to leave. But in actual fact, there is a barring order in place. He's not supposed to be in the house. So, Tusla are a law unto themselves. And that's not an isolated case. In a completely opposite end of the country, a mother rang me up. And I became quite friendly with her over a number of months. And she was in a situation where she had a barring order from her partner. Again, the co-parenting plan was that he was to come to the house every morning and collect the children for school, and he was to collect them from school and bring them home in the afternoon. And when she ended up sick and in hospital, Tusla said that he was to move back into the family home and look after the children when she was in hospital.
There's a barring order in place?
Barring order in place. A barring order in place. Now, as I say, I'm only sharing my experience of what I've come across in the last year. One mother had 3 children, and the barring order was repeatedly broken. And what the social workers right around the country say is that when the barring order is broken, that the violence that ensues when the man kicks in the back door and comes into the house, the violence that ensues is not good for the children, so they have to be removed. So, the barring order was being repeatedly broken. And by the way, it's a criminal offence to break a barring order. But these men know that they can keep breaking the barring order and they will get away with it. In actual fact, there was a lady interviewed earlier in the year by Ryan Tubridy on the Late Late. She had a horrific beating and he ended up jailed. But she actually said she had a barring order against him, but he laughed in her face every time he broke into the house. He used to laugh in her face because he knew that there was nothing going to be done about it. And it was only when nearly every bone in her body ended up broken that there was something done about him. So, and I'm getting a little bit sidetracked there. Anyhow, getting back to this lady, Tusla stepped in. She had an 8-month-old baby and she had 2 older children. They took the 2 older children and they left her with the 8-month-old baby, and on the condition that she would leave the house. So she left the house and she couch surfed. And I was in almost daily contact with her. And it was absolutely horrendous. She thought if she paid €200 a twist to the solicitor every 28 days when the care order is being renewed in the court, that she would have some hope of getting her children back, to no avail. Then, one Friday afternoon, she rang me up so excited. She said that the social worker was after telling her that she could return home with her baby. She returned home with her baby. The child was 8 months. And she was so delighted all weekend, and she got the fires going and everything else. It was in the springtime of this year. On Monday, at 4:30 in the afternoon, I was driving out of Longford and I got a phone call from her, and I pulled into the side of the road. She was in a horrendous state. 2 social workers had come into the house and taken the baby from her. They told her that that it was unsafe for the baby to be in the house, and that the young social worker that had come out on Friday and told her that she could move back in didn't have the authority to tell her that. I drove 3 hours to her house. The screams of that mother in my arms will remain with me till the day that I go under the grave. It was absolutely horrendous. 1 minute your baby is with you, the next minute your baby is gone. And what they do is they use soft coercion. And this now is being documented. A report was published this week by Kenneth Burns from University College Cork, who said that Tusla social workers are using what's called soft coercion. They tell you that if you hand over your baby voluntarily, that they'll give you the baby back. If you don't, they're going to go into court and get a full care order, and you won't see your child until it's 18. So you're there, a mother with a baby in your arms, and you have a choice. Hand over the baby now in the hope that you get the baby back, or don't hand over the baby and you go into court, you haven't the money for a solicitor, and they're going to take the child off you and you won't see it till it's 18. And that is the split-second timing decision. That baby was 8 months, had never been away from its mother, ever. Ever, ever, ever been away from its mother. On the grounds that it was not safe in the house because the partner could come back at any time into the house because he was in the habit of breaking the barring order. Okay? Now, I would appreciate if you leave the questions until the end, because it breaks my concentration. It breaks my concentration when I'm speaking if I'm answering questions. So I will answer questions at the end. Now, getting back to the mothers phoning me. If the mother has a middle-class accent when she comes on the phone to me, I know her story straight away. She's married to a paedophile, and either her children have been taken from her and the paedophile has been given full custody of the children, or she is struggling to hold on to her children. And it is absolutely horrendous what is happening in this country. It's silent. It's happening in the family law courts. The family law courts are held in camera. That means if you speak about what happens inside the court, you run the risk of a €50,000 fine, or you will be jailed. So everything happens in camera in the family law courts, and it's never spoken about. So and this is typical now of what is happening, and it's replicated right across the country. And the women that I have come in contact with are all middle-class women, married to men in very high positions in this country, very well connected to the GAA, and very well connected to politicians, and very well connected to the top echelons of the Gardaí. These are very powerful men. When when it comes to her attention that the child has been sexually abused, she goes to the Gardaí. The Gardaí then hand it over to Tusla to investigate it. Tusla then take on the investigation. Usually what happens then at this stage, the husband knows his number is up. It's straight into the family law court. Tusla have an absolutely notorious record on investigating child sex abuse. The UN Raconteur on child trafficking and child sex abuse came to Ireland in 2018 and carried out an investigation, and she published her report in March of this year. And she slated Ireland for its failure of children who are being sexually abused. And Ireland, very cleverly, has not signed up to the Lanzarote Convention, because if they sign up to the Lanzarote Convention, they can be prosecuted for their failure to protect children who are being sexually abused. Now, I'll share with you some of the stories. One mother discovered that her child was being sexually abused. Naturally, she terminated the relationship immediately. It ended up in the family law courts. The father wanted unsupervised access to the child. The child, she pleaded that the child was being sexually abused. The judge granted unsupervised access. The child and she was told by the judge that the child was to be handed over at 2 o'clock on Sunday in the Garda station for unsupervised access for the afternoon with the father. She went to the Garda station. The child, when she saw her father, absolutely screamed. She did not want to go with him. The guards stood and watched, and they could do nothing because there was a court order in place. And she shouted at the guards what her father does to her. The child was brought away screaming and bawling by the father. Now, that mother has a choice. She can drag the child and force the child to go off with the father, or if she gives in to the child and doesn't grant access to the father, she is breaking a court order. And that is a no-no in the eyes of the family law courts, and she could end up losing custody of her child. So that's one case. Another case, and this is a case now where this man has a very, very high-profile position with children. And he has been sexually abusing his 2 children. And he has been given full custody of the children. The mother is allowed to see the children once a week. And she actually has a very high-profile job as well. But wait for it. She sees the children. She has to be supervised seeing the children. So it's under supervision. And she has to pay €200 a week to a private agency to supervise her while she is with her own children for 2.5 hours. And during the summer, when she didn't have the money, she didn't get to see the children that Sunday. Like, none of this is spoken about, and none of this is in mainstream media. In another case, the mother didn't comply with the court order and give unsupervised access to the father of the child because the child did not want to go. She was summoned to court for a hearing on access. And she was in court all day, and she didn't have a solicitor to represent her. The case was heard late in the evening. In actual fact, the hearing began at 7 o'clock in the evening. And what was just an access case became a custody case. There and then, on the spot, the judge granted full custody of the child to the father. She was given 1 hour to hand the child over. She had to go home. The little girl was sitting in her school uniform watching the television. And she had to take that child and bring that child back into town and hand it over to the father who was abusing her. And he was there with his mother. And the two of them dragged the child from the mother and bundled her into the back of the car and drove off at speed. This is happening in Ireland.
These judges have names and addresses.
Okay, can I ask you please not to speak, because it breaks my concentration, and I'm sorry. I am sorry. It's the teacher coming out in me. Nobody was ever allowed to talk in my class. Yeah. I've had a mother tell me that she said to the social worker that when her daughter goes to the father for the weekend, he takes photographs of her naked standing in the shower. And the social worker turned around and said to her, that's perfectly normal.
What?
I've had a mother tell me that an 80-year-old child told the social worker that she didn't want to go to her dad at the weekend because she has to sleep with him, and she described what he does to her. And the social worker turned around and said to the child, you're old enough to get out of your daddy's bed when he makes you feel uncomfortable.
So they're putting the blame on the children?
Yes. This is what's happening in Ireland. This is what is happening in Ireland. Pedophilia is out there. I won't make wild stories about it being widespread. This is just my opinion. It's just my opinion. I have no facts and figures to back up what I'm saying. The reason why paedophilia is not being dealt with in Ireland is because it's prevalent among the middle classes. If it was among the lower working classes or the travelling community, by God, it would be dealt with. But because it's happening in the middle classes, and the men that are carrying it out are judges, high up in the Gardaí, banking officials, insurance officials, nothing is being done about it. Because the higher up you go, the smaller the community is. They are all intermarried through each other. They all know each other. They go to the same private schools. They hang out in the same golf clubs. So they all know each other, and they all protect each other. And it is amazing that if you have a case of paedophilia in a county, it should be heard in the local court. But it's not. It's always moved out to a separate county where they have their bodies in the legal profession and judges and so on to work with the paedophile to hand over the children. It was documented that late in 2017, 20 children were taken into care. These were children that were being horrifically sexually abused, including newborns, and they were being groomed from birth for paedophiles. There were 11 people arrested in connection with that. It was documented in the papers. The judge, these 11 people appeared before a judge in Limerick. She ordered that, these people's names were under no circumstances to be released. They were released on bail. It was reported in the papers at the time that the Gardaí involved said it was absolutely horrific what they experienced and that it would be the biggest scandal ever to hit Ireland. It seems, it would appear from reading between the lines in the newspapers, that a whistleblower within Tusla alerted the authorities to what was going on. Pressure came on Catherine Sapona, the Minister for Children, to open up an investigation on Tusla. That investigation was opened up and it was led by the child raconteur, Geoffrey Shanahan. And what happened? Quietly and silently, a few months later, the inquiry was suspended and remains suspended. I don't have proof of this, but I am being told by people living close to where these families, there are a couple of extended families involved in this paedophile ring, a number of their children that were taken by Tusla are actually back with them. It's absolutely horrendous what is happening. So here I am with these mothers. I attended the Safe Ireland conference last November. It was maybe the end of October last year. Safe Ireland conference. And Frances Fitzgerald spoke at it. She was she was no longer minister because she had to resign her position as Minister for Justice, so she wasn't minister at this time. But after she was Minister for Children, she became Minister for Justice. Anyhow, I met her at the conference, just like this. I went up and I shook hands with her. She's a very, very nice woman. I told her what was happening. She said she would meet with me. But 2 weeks later, I brought a number of mothers to meet with her. We were told we could not speak about individual cases. We went in and told her what was happening. It all ended up in a massive bottle of smoke, because every time I rang for a follow-up or whatever, I was fobbed off. At the same conference, I doorstepped Catherine Sapona, and she couldn't get away from me quick enough. And I asked for her to meet with us. And she said to contact her secretary. For 3 solid months, I endeavoured to get a meeting with Catherine Sapona, and it failed. She is an absolute disgrace of a woman. On her watch, horrific things are happening to children in Ireland. Sorry, I asked this. Horrific things are happening to children in Ireland. Then I watched Pat Rabbitt, who is the chairman of Tusla, appear before the Joint Committee on Children and Youth Affairs in February. And one of the deputies on that committee, Anne Rabbitt, really laid into him. In fact, she was the only person to lay into him. And I contacted her, I emailed her, not expecting to get a reply. And she got back to me straight away. And I brought a number of mothers to meet with her in Leinster House. And I have to say, She was lovely, she was warm, she was engaging. She didn't want any formalities. She just wanted to sit and listen to the women's stories. And they were from the four corners of Ireland. And on foot of that then, she worked with me. And I brought the mothers together in Athlone in June. And Anne Rabbitt paid for the hotel. And she attended. And we set up the Alliance of Birth Mothers Campaigning for Justice. And I suppose a little bit of what has happened since. I wrote up a 12,500 page report. I called it the Triad Rules. I did a review of all of the reports to date on Tusla. How children are being failed by Tusla, how children are being failed in the family law courts, and how the children are being failed by the Gardaí. So I did all the literature review that I could muster up to date on that. And then I did a survey of 25 mothers in ABC who were happy to speak to me. Now, the mothers in ABC were afraid to talk to me or give any details because of the in-camera rule. But 25 mothers agreed to do the survey with me. I wrote up the results of that survey. We put in a number of recommendations. We launched the report in Boswell's Hotel in August. And at that, we had Don Hennessy. Now, Don has worked for 30 years with women who are victims of domestic violence. He has written a number of books, and he has spoken. He was interviewed recently by Ray Darcy on his afternoon programme. And basically, you know, people like me you will say, well, why does a woman live with a man that's beating her up? And he has written about, literally, the title of one of his books is How He Gets Inside Her Head. So he compares these domestic abusers to paedophiles. They actually get inside your head and they're actually able to manipulate and control you. Yeah. And they're actually able to get inside the head of the social workers and manipulate and control them because they're actually lovely men. I sat across the table from a man that had left the woman here hospitalised from a beating. And if I had met him on the street, I would say, what a lovely man. And do you know what? In the report from the previous case meeting was written down, because she showed it to me. I never was violent, and we call her Mary. I was never a violent man until I met Mary. She knows the buttons to press that makes me angry. Imagine a social worker sat writing that down. Victim blaming. So, the profile of the women, as I say, whose children are being taken by Tusla, most of them are victims of domestic violence. Many of them grew up in the care system, and a small cohort of them are women who were the partners or married to paedophiles. People are saying to me that there is horrific abuse of children in certain sections of some of our cities. And they have reported it to the Gardaí and it's reported to Tusla and they do nothing about it. Why? Well, the reason for it is that they wouldn't dare go into these areas because they are areas that are marked out by known gangland leaders. And they know that if they go in and remove the children, that they will be targeted. So they leave the children in horrific situations. But women who are victims of domestic violence are what I would call soft targets. Women who grew up in the care system are soft targets. The other thing is this: the outcomes for children who grow up in foster care is not good. number of people who are in our prison system, a very high percentage of them grew up in state care. The people who are in our mental hospitals, a very high percentage of them grew up in state care. Now, bodies working with homeless people like Focus Ireland are saying that a high percentage of the 18 to 24-year-olds who are homeless on our streets or are in emergency accommodation grew up in state care. As soon as they're 18, the state stops paying for them. They stop paying for their foster care. So many of them actually are toughed out and end up homeless on the streets. What we have now is a massive industry. On the one hand, you have the children of these poor working class women being fed into a system where there is mega bucks, and I mean mega bucks being made. You have solicitors, judges, barristers, gals, guardian ad litems, former social workers who were appointed by the court to be the voice of the child are on €130 an hour. One of them made over €300,000 a couple of years ago. This is all in the papers. It's a massive industry, and there are people making a fortune out of it. When women go into the family law courts, these poor women are supposed to have free legal aid. Free legal aid is a misnomer. It's not free. It's €130. You have to pay for a solicitor to represent you in court. And it's usually a box-ticking exercise. Many of these women go into court and they are not legally represented. I'll just give you two cases that I was involved with recently. This woman, the Tusla closed the file on her in 2017, and she had a very tragic death in her family this summer. And 2 weeks to the day of the death, she got a summons from Tusla to appear in court on a supervision order. And she didn't have money and she didn't have time to engage a solicitor. So I went along with her. Now, I'd never been to a court before, a family law court, and I did know there was such a thing as a Mackenzie friend. You can accompany somebody into the court. So I went with her. 3 social workers turned up in the morning. One of the head social worker, that was the chief buck cat, never met this woman in her entire life before. They wanted her to engage with the free legal aid solicitor, and the woman refused to do so because she knew she was finished if she did. I went to accompany her into the court when it was called. The head social worker stood in the door and asked me where I was going. And I said I was going in as a Mackenzie friend. She said, "Oh, no, you're not." And I didn't want to create a fracas at the door of the court, and I pulled back and I left. That woman went into the court. There were 3 social workers. There was a barrister for Tusla. There was a solicitor for Tusla, 2 men, another man who did not identify himself, dressed in a suit, and a judge. That woman was in that court 7-1. And that is not unusual. Now, fortunately, she was able to pull herself together and was able to speak up for herself, because she was able to speak up for herself and she managed to get an adjournment. In another case that I'm familiar with, the mother went into court and she was not legally represented, and she asked the judge for an adjournment and he refused. And on foot of the evidence that was presented that day in court by Tusla social workers, he jailed her. And she was brought out of the court in handcuffs and loaded up into a paddy wagon and brought her up to Mountjoy. Lay litigants managed to get her out of jail after a week. There followed 5 High Court cases after that, until eventually the charges against her were completely dropped. What did it cost the state? And on every occasion, there was 2 and sometimes 3 social workers up from the country sitting around all day in the High Court, doing nothing, only just sitting there. And the top legal team that money can buy, there to represent Tusla. By the way, Tusla spends an average €28 million a year on solicitors and barristers. In 2015, Pamela Benson was appointed as head of legal services in Tusla. That year, her brother, who's a barrister, Jim, got €4,000 from Tusla. Last year, he got €77,000. The highest earning barrister in the last 3 years, 16, 17 and 18, the highest earning barrister is a fella called Leahy. I think his first name is David, I can't be sure. Leahy is his name anyhow. He has got just under €500,000 in legal fees from Tusla. Tusla is a rotten, corrupt system. And it is a money spinner for university-educated, middle-class professionals who are depending on children being taken and being fed into the system for it to survive. And this is how low they have stooped. 10 weeks ago, a mother gave birth in a hospital, and she was breastfeeding her child. I can't tell you the day that the baby was born because it will break the in-camera rule and it could give a clue to who she is. So I'm going to say that the baby was born on a Monday. The next day, Tusla social workers arrived in the hospital and told her that she was to be in court on Wednesday. On Wednesday morning, she got up, she breastfed her child, and she walked the 15 minutes from the maternity hospital to the court. As she was going in the door of the court, the Free Legal Aid solicitor turned up, didn't speak to her, and walked into the court. It's a box-ticking exercise. She's legally represented in court. She went in, and Tusla social workers, on foot of a psychological report that was carried out on her in early 2017 following a horrific domestic violence incident. On foot of that report, Tusla social workers, they'd already taken her other kids, Tusla social workers said that she didn't have the parental capacity to parent the baby. The judge gave a care order to Tusla, and she was told that she'd have to hand over the baby the following morning to the Tusla social workers. At 11, she walked back crying to the hospital. She was told at 11 o'clock on the Thursday morning that the social workers would be coming for the baby at 2 o'clock. She breastfed her baby. The social workers arrived. She put the baby in the carry tot. She went down the stairs carrying her baby. She put the baby into the back seat of the car, and the 2 social workers drove off with her baby. She brought me to the gate, it's the back gate of the hospital. She said, this is where they get the babies. They don't go out the front gate, they go out the back gate with them. She's not the only one. There's one road not far from where she lives where there's no children left in it. Hardly any children have been left in it. They've been all taken by Tusla from women like herself. That mother was given 3 accesses for the first couple of weeks to her baby, and she breastfed the baby on the accesses, and she expressed her milk and handed over her breast milk on the accesses. And then after 2 weeks, she got a phone call to say that they were short of social workers, and they could only let her see the baby once a week. That mother now sees her baby once a week. You wouldn't do it to an animal. In the animal kingdom, babies are left with their offspring. I'm from a farming background myself. You don't take the calves off the cows because it stresses them. The only time it happens is in the dairy industry, where the milk is worth more than the calves, and it doesn't matter if the calves die because they're pretty worthless. Frisian bull calves and Holstein bull calves are pretty worthless. You couldn't give them away. That's the only place that I know of where the offspring in the animal kingdom is actually taken from its mothers. In Ireland, Tusla are removing babies close to birth from mothers for no good reason at all. Bernard Gloucester, the CEO of Tusla, is 100% aware of this case. Jim Gibson, our famous Jim Gibson from here on the Grace case and the Morris McCabe case, the Chief Operations Officer in Tusla, is 100% aware of this case. And still nothing is being done. It's absolutely horrendous and horrific. I want to thank you most sincerely for listening to me. And Gay Byrne passed away and was buried on Friday. And he heralded in an era in Ireland. And that era actually, strangely enough, came to an end with his death. RTE television began broadcasting in 1963, I think it was, and Gay Byrne was there at the beginning. And he actually shone a light into the rotten parts of Ireland that we didn't want to see, and also through his radio programme. But now everything has become so bland. Mainstream media will not touch these stories with a barge pole. Believe me, I have tried. I won't go into it. There is a new era being born in Ireland, and it's the era of social media. And that is where it's at. Social media is now going to shine a light on what is happening in Ireland. And we have been shining that light on our ABC page, and there are other people here present. I have to pay tribute to one amazing woman here. This here is Angela Ray. Right? Social media is shining a light on what is rotten in Ireland, and it's beginning to get to the authorities. How do we know? Because last Wednesday morning, Bernard Gloucester, the CEO of Tusla, appeared before the Joint Committee on Children and Youth Affairs. And he actually expressed his annoyance at what was happening on social media. And Anne Rabbitte took him on, and she said, and she defended social media, and she said, the reason why this is happening on social media is because with Tusla, there is no accountability. And you have failed miserably to communicate with these mothers. Now, I also have to pay tribute to 2 other women on that committee last Wednesday morning. Kathleen Funchinan, who is the Sinn Féin TD for Carlow Kilkenny, who really took him on and asked him, she actually raised the issue of that mother that I've just been talking about, whose baby was taken. And the other person to take him on was Denise Mitchell. She took him on the soft coercion and the taking of the children into voluntary care without any legal representation. What do those 3 women have in common?
Their mothers.
3 mothers. Bernard Gloucester began his address to the committee, spent 5 minutes talking about how wonderful he is and how well qualified he is for the job. No matter how many letters he has after his name, or no matter what he has done, there is one thing one piece of experience that he will never have. He will never know what it is to carry a child in his womb for 9 months, to give birth to that baby and to suckle that baby at his breast. And that is the reason why, partly the reason why, we have the situation in this country that we have. Tusla is controlled completely by men. All the top jobs, men. The board, nearly all men. And we have a minister for children who has no children. So, I want to thank you most sincerely for listening to me, for sitting the whole way through my talk and being very good students. I really, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank you. The fact that you have turned up here and that you've sat through the talk shows that you care. What you can do to help, there are a few things that you can do. And that is share on social media the stuff that we're putting up about what's happening to these mothers. Also, get onto your local TDs. There is going to be an election in the new year, that's a given. And contact your local politicians and say that you are dissatisfied and unhappy with what is happening to birth mothers and their children. And the penny will drop. The more people that get to know about this and start to put pressure on the system, the greater are the chances that something will happen. Now,
You Twitter page?
no, I'm not a Twitter person, I'm sorry. I'm a Facebook person. Now, and I just want to put in a word of caution, and I don't know if I should say this. I am, to a certain extent, whistleblowing on what's happening. And whistleblowers generally have a price to pay. And that price is that their characters will be sabotaged. In extreme cases, they will actually be sectioned. There's a case in the UK, Melanie Shaw, the whistleblower, on what happened to the sexual abuse and the paedophile ring in the children's home in England, is now sectioned and in a mental hospital, out of circulation, because she was revealing too much. So, and that's always at the back of my mind. There has never, ever been anything done to me to make me fearful or afraid. But it's always there at the back of my mind. But I am happy to carry on this fight for justice for these mothers, even if my character is assassinated, even if I'm sectioned, and please God it will never happen. But to me, I want to carry on this fight for the mothers. And I suppose the good news is that this time last year, the mothers were not, they were not connected to each other. Now, in the last year, they have become connected to each other. And I'm going to finish my talk to make a plea for unity. I was a history teacher, and the history of Ireland is that the Irish could never agree among themselves. And time again, that led to them being conquered. And I think it goes back to Celtic times, because in Celtic times, the Iron Age, when we're living in the rats and ring forts, in order to become a warrior and to get accreditation for being a warrior, you needed a number of trophies. And the trophies were heads of your enemies. You literally had to go out and slice the head of your enemies and bring them back. And when you had so many heads, then, and the more heads you had, the more accreditation you got. And I think that that is deep down in the Irish psychic, because particularly on social media in the last couple of months, I can see the people that should be pulling together to take down the system actually taking each other out. The Irish government never has to send in its hired assassins to take out the activists, because they do a damn pretty good job themselves at taking each other out. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh. Most of the talks, we tried to keep them on schedule, but there's no fucking way I was going to interrupt that one. Can you all put your hands together once again, please, for Anna Kavanagh?